direktor Zavoda za javno zdravstvo u Zenici i večeras ću moderirati ovaj naš skup pod naslovom Javna tribina, uticaj zagađenja zraka na javno zdravlje. Kao što ste vidjeli u vašem pozivu, naš Institut za zdravlje i sigurnost hrane i Ekoforum Zenica su u saradnji sa američkom ambasadom u Sarajevu i ekspertima koji su nas posjetili na Institutu za zdravlje dogovorili jednu saradnju i zajedničku aktivnost na ovom polju da vidimo što možemo uraditi. Želim vam predstaviti našu gošću i predavača večeras, gospođu Cipel, koja je večeras s nama i imat će predavanje na ovu temu. Zaposlena je trenutno je angažirana u ambasadi, američkoj ambasadi u Sarajevu, a njen stalni posao je u američkoj agenciji za zaštitu okoliša, Environmental Protection Agency. Jako smo zahvalni i ambasadi i gospođi Haset na ovoj inicijativi i pokretanju što su nam omogućili da pokrenemo ovu raspravu. U ime Ekoforuma Zenica s nama je večeras profesor Lemeš. Ja bi sada najavio gospođu Haset njeno predavanje.
Hvala. Sorry to be closer to you, but thank you so much for inviting me. I've had the opportunity to be in this country for 2 months, and the people are wonderful, your country is beautiful, and I've learned a lot. What? Okay, great. I've learned a lot. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come here from the Public Health Institute and Ecoforum to talk to you about an issue that I've spent my career on and that I'm very passionate about, and that is air quality and public health. So what I'd like to do this evening is provide a little bit of background, talk about some of the recent international estimates of air pollution and public health impacts, talk to you about what the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has done to set national ambient air quality standards to provide public health protection, and talk about some of the specific health evidence that we have for those pollutants, but also talk a little bit broader about some of other pollutants, toxic air pollutants. And I'll specifically talk about some of the sources that are in this city. And then I want to talk a little bit about messaging to the public and sharing that information more broadly, and also provide some extra information. I believe Ecoforum has put my presentation up on their website, and there are additional links to information on the web. So air pollution has a compelling history. Back in the United States in the 40s, 50s, 1960s, 1970s, as well as cities around the world, we saw some really, really horrible conditions. In the top left-hand corner is Denora, Pennsylvania, a coal mining town that saw a horrific episode in the late 40s. The London fog in the early 50s was probably the worst episode of air pollution that we've recorded in modern times. And then some of the other large cities in the United States, New York City and Los Angeles, who have had challenges. On the right-hand side, I've included some, pointer. I've included just some of our very precious national parks, because air pollution issues have not always been limited to just cities, but also to our very, what we call Class 1 or protected areas. But the good news is that we have made tremendous progress. It has taken time, it has taken commitment, but we have made tremendous progress, not only in the United States and London, but in other parts of the world. So you can see that we have recovered in these areas that were horrific. That the street lights were coming on at lunchtime, and now we have these very beautiful areas. The work in the United States is not done. There's still work to be done. But I'm telling you that there are success stories and there has been great progress made. So just a little bit of background on air pollution. It comes from a lot of different sources. That's one of the challenges. We have large industrial sources. We have power plants. We have steel mills like in this town. We have mobile sources. We have mobile sources, cars and trucks. We have home heating with wood and coal. We have some natural sources. We have mining operations. There's a wide range of air pollution sources that we have to take them into consideration in total, because the air that you and I are breathing, that our people in the cities or in the towns are breathing, is a combination. So pollutants can be emitted directly from these sources, and they can be formed once they've been emitted from their sources through atmospheric transformation, weather conditions, sunlight, things like that. So I just wanted to again kind of talk about natural sources, mobile sources, cars, trucks, buses, ships, motorcycles, trains, anything that moves. Stationary sources, these are usually large facilities that we think about. And then area sources. Here we can think about farms, we can think about dry cleaners, smaller sources. And you know, we've been doing a really good job of trying to understand what people are exposed to, both from ability to measure it in the outdoor ambient air, as well as we learn more about the transformation of these products, we can also model it. And our models are getting better, understand not only the impacts on air, but also deposition into water and land. So our technologies are improving, the science is getting better, and we're getting a better understanding of what people are exposed to. So, one of the particular issues in this country, and it also happens in other countries that are mountainous, is wintertime aversions. I know that you all are familiar with these. And this is where, in an area valley like this, especially in the wintertime, we get cold air trapped underneath some warm air. And the warm air basically serves as a lid, a stop. And the air at the bottom of the valley can't get out. And so all the emissions that continue in the valley get stuck here until something dramatic happens, a big rainstorm, some kind of weather condition to break it up. I've looked at some of the air quality data that has been developed in Zenica and Sarajevo and some of the other areas in this country, and I definitely see some very high concentrations in the wintertime. This has happened in other areas in the United States as well as Europe. We can't move the mountains, so we have to do something else to improve the air underneath. So I promised to talk about some of the recent international estimates. There's a recent report that just came out last month called the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look at it. What its purpose was to raise global awareness of pollution and neglect, this is in the yellow box in the right-hand corner, and neglect of pollution-related disease, and mobilize the resources and political will needed to effectively control pollution. This is a call for action. This is an international committee looking at available information, pointing out the impacts of pollution, and specifically the impacts of air pollution to the global health. Recognizing that all countries have challenges that they have to overcome. The graph here pulls out, summarizes two estimates that this report relied on. One is the Global Burden of Disease study, and this last looked at the year 2015, and then the World Health Organization estimate from 2012. They're not quite the same. They used a little bit definitions, but they're pretty darn close. And what it shows is that pollution-related premature deaths, mortality, is related to 9 million deaths a year. And of those, 6.5 million are related to air pollution. That's indoor air pollution as well as outdoor pollution. That's 2/3 of the pollution-related deaths. It's a significant amount. And this report really is a call for action for the international community to come together and work together and solve this problem. There are other estimates. I've just included a couple of the World Health Organization reports in the bottom here. But they're all really, really wonderful sources of information. So I pulled out a few specific data points for Bosnia and Herzegovina that I thought was interesting. From the WHO World Health Organization report in 2012, they looked at the mortality rate, and they standardized it for the population. Here we go. Per 100,000 population. So you can compare the numbers. And Bosnia and Herzegovina, unfortunately, was at the very highest or the worst within Europe. This is all of Europe. And I pulled out just a couple of other countries, the US and Sweden as comparison. There's a lot of room for improvement. This is from the Global Burden of Disease 2015 report. And this is looking at all of the causes of premature mortality. And it specifically identifies ambient particulate matter as number 5, right here in the yellow, and specifically talks about the types of effects related to premature mortality, which includes lower respiratory infections, cancers, cardiovascular disease, and chronic respiratory disease. So those are the big. Now this is just looking at premature mortality. It's not looking at other effects associated with air pollution. And this again is from the state. This is from the State of Global Air 2017. The Health Effects Institute and others have worked on this. It's a really good opportunity to look at the concentrations of PM2.5. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It's an indicator of fine particle exposure. It's where we have very, very strong evidence of premature mortality as well as cardiovascular effects. And this is showing, just from an annual average concentration, again, that this country, is the highest in Europe. It takes the available measurement data. It also uses some satellite data to try and estimate exposure. So there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. So, what we've been talking about with these international estimates are premature mortality associated with air pollution exposure. But that's just the tip of the pyramid. That's just this red box at the top. That's where, when you see estimates of the benefits associated with air pollutant exposures, it's primarily this tip, because that's where you get the most benefits, or economists can estimate the most benefit. But there's a whole list of other effects that have been associated with air pollutants that we also have to consider. And that includes things like emergency department visits, hospitalizations, doctor visits, missing school, missing work, respiratory symptoms, medication use, for example, for asthma exacerbation, and also decrements or decreasing lung function capacity. So as we go up to the tip of this pyramid, we get more severe effects, but there are less people affected. As we go further down, we have milder effects, but a lot more people affected. So I just want you to keep in mind that when you see the international estimates, which primarily focus on mortality, it's just looking at the tip of this pyramid. All right, so when we look at health evidence, what kind of information do we consider in the U.S. and in other countries? We look at epidemiology studies. Those are population studies looking to try and link exposures with particular health effects. These may look at, they may look retrospectively, they may look at past exposures and past information on health events, or they may start today and look and follow a population into the future. The good thing here is that we're not changing people's exposures, exposure that they're exposed to in everyday life. But we're studying them to see if we can identify what exposures are linked to what health effects. This includes, you can include large parts of the population. We also do controlled human exposure studies. This is where we take a small number of people, usually healthy individuals, usually young individuals, and expose them to a low concentration of air pollution and try and look to see if we see any effects in the laboratory. These are limited typically to healthy people, and they're low concentrations that we know won't cause any severe effects. We also have the ability to study animals and cells, biological cells, to look for effects in those populations and try and link them. What we try and do is in this stool here, a three-legged stool. We look to try and, at the weight of evidence, the entire weight of evidence, from the epidemiology or population studies out in cities and towns, the clinical studies of humans in the laboratory, and then the animal studies and cellular studies in the laboratory. And we link them together, because the effects that we see in people, we need to show that there's biological plausibility for them in the other studies. And just like a three-legged stool that you sit on, it takes all three of them to really kind of give us the weight of evidence that we feel confident in the data. So the United States Environmental Protection Agency is charged with enforcing many environmental statutes. And the one that I have worked most closely with is the Clean Air Act. It was originally set in the 1960s, and it was amended in 1970, 1977, and 1990. It's a very strong law. And one part of the law requires the agency to set national ambient air quality standards. And those are for pollutants that are emitted from a wide number of sources and that a lot of people are exposed to. And they are what we refer to as criteria pollutants. Agency sets two types of standards: primary standards, which are health-based standards, and secondary standards, which are welfare-based standards. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the primary standards. All I'll say about the secondary standards is they are very important. They protect against effects like visibility, material damage to buildings, ecosystem effects, effects on water, land, and animals in our environment. But that's not the focus of my talk tonight. But if you're interested, I can give you some more information. So today, the agency, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, has set national ambient air quality standards for 6 pollutants: particulate matter, ozone, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. I'm going to mainly talk about particulate matter tonight, but I'll touch upon the other ones. So particles come in lots of different sizes and shapes. I had one atmospheric chemist describe them to me as snowflakes. They're all different. You can have primary pollutants emitted from sources. They can change in the atmosphere. They can be solid. They can be semi-volatile. They can be liquids. You can have a small particle that then gets stuck to other things. So they grow and they change and they're different. And they change over time and space. But the thing is that we measure particles as a complete entity, and that we have very strong evidence to link particle exposure to adverse health effects. So particles, both in the US as well as the EU, typically talk about fine particles and coarse particles. And there's differences. There's differences in the types of sources where these particles come from, as well as the health effects associated with them. So I just wanted to take a minute and talk about the differences. So for fine particles, these are typically related to combustion sources, burning things. So you may see them related to coal and oil combustion. You may see them related to wood burning. You may see them related to automobile, truck exhaust, things like that. What's important to know about fine particles is they're very, very small. I'll show you a picture in the next slide. And they can stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. And they can travel long distances. So fine particles that are emitted here, in this city, can be transported 1,000 kilometers or more. And they'll change as they're transported. And they can stay in the atmosphere for days to weeks. So just think about that. So coarse particles, inhalable coarse particles, on the other hand, are really created by crushing and grinding operations. So think about mining operations, construction, tire and brake wear on your cars. Those are kind of activities that will create coarse particles. These particles are typically only stay in the atmosphere maybe days, so a shorter amount of time. They don't travel nearly as far, closer to hundreds of kilometers rather than thousands of kilometers. So different kinds of exposures to consider. So this is an illustration that the United States Environmental Protection Agency has used for a long time. And what it shows is, well, this long thing is a strand of hair. So think about how wide your hair is. What you see in the bottom left-hand corner is a grain of sand you find on the beach. See how large it is? The coarse particles that we're talking about are here in the blue. They're on average less than 10 microns, so quite small. But the fine particles that we're talking about, my point is not working, here it is, are even smaller. So just think about the differences. And so one of the reasons why these fine particles can travel and stay in the atmosphere so long is they're pretty light. And so what happens when you breathe in particles? So big particles, bigger than generally on average 10 microns, will get stuck in your nose. There's a reason why your nose is constructed the way it is. It gets stuck and end up blowing it out. It's not too much of a problem. But anything smaller gets absorbed into what they call the thoracic region. And that's a problem. So you can inhale these smaller particles. They can penetrate, some of them penetrate deeper into your lung. They can cause problems in your lung. They can also react with your lungs. They can be absorbed into your body. So you may see effects on the respiratory system, on your lungs, as well as effects on other systems. So what do we know about the health effects of particles? Well, we know that PM, especially fine particles, what we call PM 2.5, are associated with a wide number of health effects. Most importantly, cardiovascular effects, heart attacks and strokes, aggravation of asthma and chronic bronchitis, and other respiratory effects, and also associated with premature mortality. Those are the estimates that I showed in the beginning, international estimates. And those premature mortality is generally related to cardiovascular effects. So, because there's a steel mill in this town, I thought it would be important to talk about an intervention study that was done a while back. There's a gentleman at Brigham Young University in Utah, really wonderful gentleman, Arden Pope, who took advantage of what we call a natural experiment. This is where there's a steel mill in town, and it shut down. There was a labor strike, there was a work strike, and so the mill shut down for 1 year. And the really interesting part about this area is, one, there was a lot of air quality measurement data in this area, both before the steel mill shut down, when it was shut down, and then when it restarted after about 13 months or so. It was also a population that was fairly easy. They lived in a valley. It was a population primarily of non-smoking people. There wasn't a lot of other occupational exposures in the town. And so Dr. Pope took the opportunity with his team to study this particular situation. And what he found was that here they had PM10 concentrations, so the larger particles, that when he looked at the concentrations of PM10 and he looked at hospital admissions for respiratory effects, he saw a correlation. So on the left-hand corner, it's just a little tricky when I'm looking at the local language. The left-hand corner, this is PM10 concentration, and this yellow bar is when the steel mill was shut down for this work strike. And then on the right-hand corner, we have hospital admissions for all age people. Again, during the same time, we see that there was a decrease in the hospital admissions at the same time that the steel mill was shut down. So it's an interesting association. And what they were able to do was take some of the measurements and some of the particles and bring them back to the lab at EPA, and the EPA scientists analyzed it. And in this case, this was an assessment of the metals in the components. Because remember I said that particles are a mixture of a lot of different things, and it includes some metals. And what's interesting is, again, this first bar is before the steel mill shut down. The middle one is while it was shut down. I'm having trouble with my pointer. Here we go. And then this is after its restart. So there's an obvious difference both in the amount of particles as well as the composition. And this is the types of metals that were analyzed. And Dr. Pope also brought some of those samples to EPA, and some of my colleagues actually did some experiments in the Research Triangle Park in the Carolina labs. And what they found was that with these particles collected, that there was acute airway injury and inflammation in rats and in humans. So they studied animals as well as humans. They also saw differences in the particles when the steel mill was operating versus when it was shut down. Whether it's related to the metal content, as I showed in the previous slide, is still a question, but it was a really nice collection of studies that took advantage of what we call a natural experiment. And this has happened in a couple other instances. During the Beijing Olympics, when they closed down a lot of the traffic to the city during the games, they were able to study the air before the Olympic Games, during the Olympic Games, and after the Olympic Games. There was also a ban in high sulfur coal in Ireland, and so they will be able to look at measurements of PM before the ban went into effect, and health effects, and after it went in. So it's kind of before and after. It's a very abrupt change, and it's a good opportunity to study what's going on. So beyond particles, there are other criteria pollutants that we're interested in. Ozone is one that a lot of areas in the United States are still struggling to meet. Ozone is formed from chemical reactions in the air from oxides of nitrogen, NOx, and organic compounds, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. And what's special is that it takes sunlight. It takes sunlight to help this interaction. So most commonly we see ozone, increases in ozone concentration in the summertime months when it's warm and it's sunny. But we have found in the last few years, some parts of the western United States, we're seeing higher ozone concentrations in the winter. And it's an area of active research on our part, as well as our regional office out in Denver. Ozone is not just a pollutant for cities. It gets picked up and it gets traveled with the weather. So, especially in the United States, you can see ozone concentrations in monitors, especially what we call the northeast corner. You can see that over time, you can see the ozone concentrations increase. So ozone is being transported, and it's something that we are still actively working on in the United States. So ozone has a number of health-related effects, primarily on the respiratory system. We have a very large body of scientific evidence that shows that ozone causes a lot of these respiratory symptoms. It reduces lung functions, makes it harder to breathe really, really deep. It inflames and damages the airways. Sometimes people talk about it as sunburn on the inside of your lungs. It aggravates lung disease if someone already has a pre-existing respiratory condition, including those with asthma or emphysema or bronchitis. It increases the frequency and the severity of asthma attacks. I'm not sure about this country, but in the United States we have some areas in the country where the incidence of asthma is increasing significantly. So we've also been looking more and more at repeat ozone damage and just seeing how protective our standards are. We actually just changed our standard in 2015 to make it more health protective. So these effects can lead to a lot of different things. One is increasing the medication that's used, especially for people with asthma, increasing the amount of times people have to go to the doctors to get checked out, and maybe miss school or work days. It could be increased emergency department visits or hospital admissions for people with severe effects. And there's also increasing evidence of a risk of premature death. And what I forgot to talk about with particles, and I'll emphasize that from here with ozone, is that we have some populations within the overall population, people, that are more sensitive, that they're at higher risk for the effects of exposure to these pollutants. And for both particles and ozone, populations that have increased risk include children, older adults, and people with pre-existing disease. Ozone is pre-existing respiratory disease. For particles, it's pre-existing respiratory and cardiac disease. For ozone, we're also concerned about outdoor workers. That's because they're spending more time in elevated concentrations. So, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide are the indicators we use for groups of compounds, oxides of sulfur and oxides of nitrogen. So, NO2 contributes to the formation of ozone. I talked about that along with VOCs. And SO2 and NO2 both contribute to the formation of particles. Here are sulfates and nitrate particles. The primary source for sulfur dioxide are power plants and other industrial facilities, and the primary source for nitrogen dioxide and other oxides of nitrogen are mobile sources, cars and trucks and mobile sources, as well as power plants. For oxides of nitrogen and sulfur, it's all about respiratory effects. And so we're really looking here about aggravation of asthma symptoms and contributing to actually the development of asthma. And in 2010 was the first time that US EPA actually set very short-term standards for NO2 and SO2, and they set 1-hour standards for both of these. And the last two criteria pollutants are carbon monoxide and lead. These are really good news stories for the United States. Both of them have really reduced the concentrations of these significantly. We really don't have any areas that have problems at this time. So carbon monoxide, CO, is a colorless, odorless gas emitted from combustion processes, including mobile sources. A lot of the changes we've made in car engines have helped us improve reductions in exposures to CO. CO is all about effects on the ability to carry oxygen in your blood. And at extremely high levels, CO can cause death. I think we saw that it was older cars, but we don't seem to have that problem now in the United States. Lead is a neurotoxicant. It hits the nervous system, and it specifically impacts kids. But lead is a really good news story because we moved lead from gasoline, we moved lead from paint. We've really done a really wonderful job of reducing exposures to lead. So I talked about weight of evidence. I talked about weight of evidence by looking at the epidemiology data, the clinical human data, and the toxicological animal and cellular data. And when EPA looks across the breadth of information we have for these pollutants, we have developed a weight of evidence scale or determination. So where we have very, very strong evidence, we call that a causal relationship. Where we have strong evidence, but not quite as strong, we would say it's likely to be a causal relationship. And so the strength of the evidence is highest at the top of this list and lower at the bottom. So then in the middle we have suggested, that we have some suggestive evidence, but there's still some questions, and then inadequate to infer a causal relationship and not likely to be a causal relationship. The reason why I go through this criteria is just to show you on the next slide that for the six, this is for 5 pollutants, this doesn't include lead. For these 5 criteria pollutants, as we look at all of the information, what does it tell who we have the strongest evidence? So where you see the blue boxes, the darker blue boxes, this is where we have the strongest evidence. We feel very confident that these effects are associated with exposure to these pollutants. So this is the type of outcome category, and we've divided it into short-term exposures, which is basically hours, days, maybe a few weeks, and long-term exposures. And the long-term exposures would be more weeks to months to years. And you'll see that for each of our pollutants, and even within our particle pollutants, PM2.5 and PM10 minus 2.5, which is coarse particles, we have different levels of information. We have different strengths of evidence. So I tell you this because it's not only about the strength of the evidence, but as we set the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, we look at what concentrations have we seen these effects at? What do we know about the at-risk populations? What do we know about people's exposure to these pollutants? And how do we set standards that are requisite? They're protective. They're not more or less than they need to be, but they're protective of public health. So a lot of consideration that goes into setting these standards to provide the appropriate public health protection. Okay, just wanted to, beyond the international estimates of impacts of air pollutants, I also wanted to talk about some large scientific bodies that have actually put out statements related to air pollution and health effects. So it's not just the United States Environmental Protection Agency, it's not just the World Health Organization, the government organizations like, or international organizations like that. The 2 statements on the left are from the American Heart Association. So, you know, back in the 90s when we were seeing a lot of effects from PM, everyone thought it was respiratory. And as we studied it more and more and more, we really saw a strong cardiovascular heart component. And the American Heart Association, which is a large body of doctors in the United States, put out the first scientific statement in 2004, updated in 2010, basically supporting similar conclusions to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Since we're across the big pond, the Atlantic Ocean, I also wanted to bring in a couple of the European experts. So this is an expert position paper on air pollution and cardiovascular disease. Again, very similar conclusions as the American Heart Association. And this last point, and I believe the Echo Forum has put my presentation up online, and there's links to these papers. This is a joint statement from the European as well as the American Thoracic Societies. So this is a joint US and the EU. And again, it really talks about what constitutes an adverse effect, how do you develop a framework for evaluating. It's really, really great, and all very recent publications. So, you know, in the United States, we have a good news story. We're not done. We are absolutely not done. We still have work to be done. But, you know, one of the comments that we often hear is, it's too expensive. It's too expensive to clean up air pollution. It's going to cost too much money. And I'm going to tell you that we have, since 1970, when the first standards were issued, if you look at this bottom pink line, there we go. This is the 6 criteria pollutants that I've been talking about, and this is the percent that we have reduced the emissions of these pollutants. It's from 1970 to 2016. It's a 73% reduction in emissions. And we've done that while we have also increased our gross domestic product. We have increased the cars on the road and the vehicle miles traveled. We have increased our energy consumption, and our population has increased dramatically, 58%. All of these things have increased, and yet we've reduced our air pollutant exposures. And I will tell you that when we look at the benefits for controlling air pollutants, and we look at the impacts on public health, we see anywhere from 4 to, I think it's 90 times the benefits compared to the cost of controlling. So it can be done in a cost-effective way, and we get huge public health benefits. Okay, I was also asked to talk beyond the criteria of pollutants. So in the Clean Air Act and the amendments in 1990, one section of the Clean Air Act specified what is now 187 specific pollutants. And there is some overlap because lead, which is PB, appears on the list of 187 hazardous air pollutants, but it's also criteria pollutants. And I talked about PM being a mixture of pollutants. Particles and mixture of pollutants, but it includes several of the pollutants that are on the hazardous air pollutant list. So there's overlap. And it's slightly different. With the criteria pollutants, what the agency does is set a national ambient air quality standards that all areas in the country are supposed to work to meet. And if an area doesn't meet it, they have to come up with an implementation plan on how they're going to meet it. With hazardous air pollutants, this is a bit different. It's a two-step process. The first phase is to actually look at where the current industry is and look at the best control, maximum achievable control technology for that technology across the country. So it's basically the cleanest plants, they're going to set the standard for all the other plants to meet. But that's not enough. The Clean Air Act requires us to go back, and it requires us to go back after about 8 years to assess, is there an unreasonable risk that's still associated with emissions from those plants, and do we need to put more controls on? So it's a two-step process. So, because there's a large steel mill in this town, I thought it was important to just share with you what the United States has done for integrated, it's called iron and steel manufacturing facilities as a source category. So we set a national emission standard for hazardous air pollutants, or NESHAP, most recently in 2006, so just over 10 years ago. And that residual risk assessment is ongoing right now. It's supposed to be done within 8 years, but it's on target right now to be completed in 2019. So there's a number of hazardous air pollutants that are emitted from these facilities, and I've listed some of them. And there's a number of different sources within a facility. So what this tries to do is look at all of this, like put a bubble over the facility and look at it in that light. So there's a number of sources for toxicity information that's readily available on the web. The first one is the United States Integrated Risk Information System, IRIS. The state of California, the California Environmental Protection Agency has done a number of assessments on their own, so they have a great deal of information available too, as well as the United States Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR. So I just include these as just resources that are, if you're interested in following up for a particular pollutant, these are good places to look for information. Okay, so how do we share information with the public about air quality? A number of years ago, we decided to develop basically a simple scale for the criteria pollutants. It's used for 5 of the criteria pollutants: particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and CO. And the air quality index is reported for the highest pollutant, or the one that is the worst. So it basically puts it on a scale. I'll show you the scale on the next slide. So this information also recommends steps that individuals can take to reduce their exposures. If we really think about exposure as equal to concentration, what's in the atmosphere, times time, how long you're in that environment, times ventilation rate. So as I'm standing here, I'm not breathing very hard. But if I were running, if I were biking, if I were working, manual labor, I might be breathing much harder. And so therefore I would be getting more of a dose. So when in high pollution environments, we think about how we can either reduce concentration, reduce ventilation, or reduce time. Because any one of those will reduce your exposure. So the air quality index converts the pollutant concentrations to a number on a scale from 0 to 500. Generally, 100 is the level of the standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards that the U.S. EPA has set, the ones that I talked about before. And large cities and states are required to report the air quality index for today as well as the forecast for tomorrow. So this is a scale, I call it a rainbow scale. Green, yellow is pretty good. 100, remember, is the level of the short-term standard. And then, you know, things get worse as the colors get warmer or brighter. And so they first get more of concern. Orange is members of at-risk populations or sensitive groups may experience health effects when healthy people still aren't experiencing effects. But as the colors get brighter, we're concerned even for the healthy population. And I included this slide just to show you that the scales. So this takes concentration of the gases like ozone and nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide in parts per million or parts per billion, and particles in micrograms per cubic meter. And one thing I wanted to show you is that PM10, which is our indicator for coarse particles, the scale is very different than the scale for fine particles, PM 2.5. So just see that at the point where you're going to be getting into the orange zone, where you're concerned about effects on at-risk populations, it's not going to show it, here we go. The scale is very different. So the scale for PM 2.5 is 35.5 to 55.4 micrograms per cubic meter, and the scale for PM10 is 155 to 254. A big, big difference. Okay, we have lots of information that we share with the public. The US EPA does via the internet, and then also through a lot of outreach. This is just a few examples. I know we have some physicians, some doctors in the room. We've been doing a lot of outreach to the medical community. So you'll see we have this in the left-hand corner is heart disease, stroke, and outdoor air pollution. We have a new continuing medical education class that we put online to teach medical health professionals more about the impacts of particle pollution. For those of you who are interested more in ways to measure pollutants in ambient air, there's new technologies that are being developed all the time, and we typically call them air sensors. So we have a toolbox that explains how we evaluate those new technologies and what we're learning about them as they're evolving. We've taken some of the information and translated it into Spanish because that's a language that's used a lot in our states. But we share the information, that rainbow chart, the air quality index. We put it up on the web. It's shared in newspapers. It's sent out in apps on your mobile phone. There's a lot of information that's shared. This is a new mobile source app that we are testing this year for wildland fires. Wildfires has become a very large issue in the United States, and so we have developed a new mobile device app to share information about the health impacts of wildfires and also collect information from the public that are exposed to some of those wildfire emissions. So there's a lot of other information that's available. And depending upon what you're interested in, this may or may not be what you're looking for. If you're looking for something else, I'm happy to talk to you and share with you other sources of information. This is information about the U.S. Clean Air Act, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards that we set. also the World Health Organization, specific information for medical professionals, and then Air Now, which also includes some international data. But what I'd like to conclude with is just a summary. I've been in this country for about 2 months, and I'll stay for another month. And I was asked to come here to help people and share information on what the United States has done for air pollution, especially related to health impacts, particularly related to particulate matter. I will tell you that I am so impressed with the people in this country. The people have been very welcoming to me. I have found them to be very open and very receptive to listening and sharing with me. And I think that there is a strong interest, and I would really like to see a lot of stakeholders coming together to tackle this challenge. As I said, every country in the world has some air pollution issues. But there are some specific ones here that I think we have information that can be used to make progress and to improve public health. What it's going to take is that stakeholders work together, that there are resources and time and talents directed at this issue, that there are educational opportunities for all stakeholders, and that people work together. You build trust among the stakeholder groups, and that you work together to really improve things, not only for people here and now, but for future generations. That's what we really need to be working on. So I appreciate your time. My contact information is here. I'll be in Sarajevo through December 8th, and I'll be back in the United States, but I'm happy to answer questions tonight or any questions that come up into the future. Thank you for your attention.